The next few slides contain information that we've already covered. I'm just going to pull it together in a different way and organize it. And basically what we're doing now is we're starting to build our final concept map. So the first thing I want to remind you of is the oxygen carrying capacity. Okay, and this tells us how much how much oxygen we can carry in the blood. Or another way of calling it is the oxygen concentration of arterial blood. And this depends on two factors. The primary factor is how much hemoglobin is in the blood, because hemoglobin is what carries most of our oxygen. About 98% of our oxygen is carried on hemoglobin. So the more hemoglobin you have, the more oxygen you can carry. And then the second factor that affects how much oxygen we can carry is how much hemoglobin is saturated. So remember that each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygens, but that doesn't mean every hemoglobin is carrying 4 oxygens. If every hemoglobin in the body was carrying its full capacity of 4, saturation would be 100%. But most healthy people usually have their blood saturated at about 98 to 99% at rest and also during exercise. The second factor I want to remind you of is the blood flow rate to the muscle. So how much blood is being delivered to the muscle. And this depends on two things. This depends on the amount of blood flow going out to the entire system, which is our cardiac output, and what percentage of that cardiac output is being distributed specifically to the muscle. So this brings us back to this one. If you remember that we talked about at rest, cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute, and about 15 to 20% of that goes to the muscle, and therefore muscle blood flow at rest is about 0.75 liters per minute. During exercise, we get an increase in cardiac output, so we get more total blood flow out to the system. We also get a greater distribution of that blood flow to the muscle during exercise, and together that results in a significant increase in muscle blood flow during exercise. Okay? So oxygen carrying capacity during exercise doesn't change. Okay, it's always pretty much maximal. But what we find is that the blood flow rate to the muscle increases during exercise because both cardiac output increases and the distribution of that cardiac output to the muscle increases. And together, the blood flow rate and the amount of oxygen in the blood determine the delivery rate, the oxygen delivery rate to the tissues or to the muscle. So what this looks like here is we've got our oxygen delivery rate, which is determined partly by the oxygen carrying capacity and the blood flow rate to the muscle. Okay? And the oxygen carrying capacity is determined by the hemoglobin concentration and the oxygen saturation, and the blood flow rate to the muscle is determined by cardiac output and distribution of blood to muscle. Okay, so that's the hierarchy that basically illustrates this slide right here. Okay. And this slide is really valuable to help you pull all that together, and this is going to be reflected on your final concept map. Alright, this next slide again is going to review information that we've already talked about. And we've talked about oxygen unloading from hemoglobin. And remember that oxygen either loads or unloads hemoglobin, either loads or unloads oxygen depending on where we are in the body. So in the lungs, we need hemoglobin to load oxygen, grab it so it can, as it's coming in from the alveoli, so it can be delivered to the cells. And then once hemoglobin gets to the cells, particularly the muscle, we need hemoglobin to unload to make that oxygen available to be taken up by the muscle. And we said that unloading depends on local factors. Okay, and I described hemoglobin, or I compared it to a magnet, and I said basically when it's on, it grabs oxygen, and when it's off, it lets go. And so in the lungs, the hemoglobin magnet is on, so it's going to grab and load oxygen. In the tissues, and particularly the muscles, we need hemoglobin to let go. We need the magnet to turn off. We need hemoglobin to let go and unload oxygen so it can get into the muscle. Whether or not hemoglobin unloads depends on the local factors in the environment. So for instance, if we're at the muscle and the muscle is using oxygen, then the PO2 in the plasma, in the capillaries around that working muscle cell, is going to be relatively low because oxygen is being taken up. And the lower the oxygen level in the area, the more likely hemoglobin is able to unload. And so it helps to match the supply with demand. The other factor that affects unloading is pH. Okay? And you know that when you're exercising, the pH drops. Okay? And pH is a measure of hydrogen ion concentration. So one of the reasons that the pH drops is because during exercise we produce more lactic acid. Okay. And that's going to bring hydrogen ions concentration up and pH down. The other reason why we are producing more hydrogen ions during exercise is because we're producing more CO2. And remember that CO2 binds with water, and most of the CO2 is carried as bicarbonate ion, and in the process of creating bicarbonate ion, we also create some hydrogen ions, which further will cause a reduction in pH. And with a reduced pH, we get more unloading. Okay? And then the third factor that affects unloading is the temperature, the local temperature. And again, remember that when we're doing exercise, we're using our glucose and our FFA. We're using some oxygen. In the process, we make ATP, CO2, we make some water, and then we also have heat as a byproduct. Okay, so during exercise, the temperature in the area goes up, again helping hemoglobin to unload and helping to meet the demands of the area. So what we see during exercise is greater unloading from hemoglobin at a time when we need greater unloading from hemoglobin at the muscle because the muscle is using more oxygen. And the three things that affect this unloading are the drop of PO2 in the plasma, the drop of pH because of hydrogen ions and CO2, and the rise in temperature as a byproduct of muscle contraction. The second factor that I want to remind you of is the oxygen diffusion rate, and this was described by Fick. And Fick said that the rate that a gas diffuses, and we're talking specifically about oxygen here, is related to the area, the diffusion membrane area. It's also affected by the diffusion coefficient, which is a constant, and each gas has its own diffusion coefficient, so oxygen has a diffusion coefficient. It's also affected by the pressure gradient, and in this case it's going to be the oxygen gradient between the capillary blood and the muscle. And fourth, it's affected by the thickness of the diffusion membrane, which is T. Okay? And during exercise, the oxygen diffusion rate goes up, not because the coefficient changes, because that coefficient is constant, and not because the diffusion membrane gets any thicker, because we cannot, although membranes technically can get thicker over time, they're not going to thicken on an acute basis. So the two things that we see change during exercise is we see greater diffusion area and a greater pressure gradient, and together those things help the oxygen diffusion rate to increase during exercise. And if you are diffusing oxygen faster and you're unloading more, you end up taking more up by the muscle. Okay, but let's talk about these two here a little bit more. All right, so I said during exercise, and we're talking here about oxygen diffusion from the capillary into the muscle. Okay. And the two that do change during exercise are the diffusion area and the diffusion pressure gradient. Now, one thing, and I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but all of the cells in the body have capillaries. I think we've talked about this. Okay. But most of the time, your capillaries are closed. Okay. Because there's some sphincters that can close off capillaries, so that if a cell doesn't need a lot of blood flow, it will close off most of its capillaries, so it can provide just the amount of blood flow it needs. What we see during exercise is we get an increase in capillary recruitment. Okay, so if this is a muscle cell that needs more oxygen, then what's going to happen is these are going to start to open up. Okay, the body is going to recruit more capillaries. The sphincters are going to relax. Okay, and when you increase capillary recruitment, you have more open capillaries, and this is going to increase the blood flow coming into the muscle. So what we see during exercise is this area increases, which helps increase the rate that gas diffuses in. The other thing that we see during exercise that changes is the pressure gradient. Okay, so we have muscle, and we have a capillary. Okay, and we have oxygen. We have a PO2 here. We have oxygen moving here. Okay, it's moving from high to low. So this is P1 and this is P2. This oxygen coming into the muscle from the arteries does not change with exercise. But what does happen is that P2 drops during exercise. Okay? Because as the muscle cell is using more oxygen, the PO2 in the muscle cell is going to drop. Okay? And so if we're looking at a gradient of P1 minus P2, P1's not changing, P2 is getting smaller, then the entire gradient is going to get larger. Okay? And with a larger gradient, we get a faster rate of diffusion. Okay, so let's summarize here what happens during exercise. So we see a greater oxygen delivery rate because we get a greater blood flow. Okay, during exercise, the oxygen concentration in the blood doesn't change because we don't gain any hemoglobin on an acute basis, and saturation is also already pretty optimal at 98–99%, even during heavy exercise. So what we see during exercise is oxygen is delivered faster because there's more blood being delivered to the muscle, and that's because there's more blood being delivered out to the whole system, and a greater proportion of that is being distributed to the muscle cell. Alright, also what we see during exercise is a greater oxygen uptake rate because we have greater oxygen unloading from hemoglobin. The reason we have greater oxygen unloading from hemoglobin is because we have a lower PO2 in the plasma, we have a lower pH, and we have a higher temperature, and all of those three things contribute to greater unloading. And then this oxygen uptake rate is also affected by a greater diffusion rate during exercise, and that occurs because we have greater diffusion area. Coefficient doesn't change, thickness doesn't change, but this pressure gradient changes because that PO2 in the muscle, which is P2, goes down during exercise. So you can see all the multiple things here that are helping to contribute to an increased oxygen uptake rate during exercise.